Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And welcome to a special early edition of Sabbath Sunday. And we're doing this special early edition, which is showing up. The release of this video will be on a Thursday because it is the 40th anniversary of the release of Dio's Holy Diver. So we wanted to bring Sabbath Sunday a little earlier here to celebrate this milestone album. Ronnie James Dio leaves Black Sabbath and launches his solo band Dio. And for that, we had to bring in a special guest, Tony Dio. Tony's been here a bunch of times at the Lair, and whenever we talk Dio, we like to try to have Tony on here because he's always has a lot of great insights and everything. So Tony, thanks for joining me and Darren here again at Sabbath Sunday.
Absolutely. Great to celebrate such a monumental metal album.
All right, well, let's go back. What are your memories of this album when it came out? What are your just overall feelings and thoughts on this record?
Well, I think I've mentioned before, maybe on here, my whole introduction to Sabbath, Dio, Ozzy, and everything was probably about probably late 81 or early 82. Someone gave me a TDK cassette, and it had Blizzard of Oz on one side, and it had Heaven and Hell on the other side. And
Wow.
so it opened my world to all things Black Sabbath there. And so coming up on started getting into some of the stuff and trying to pick up stuff here and there where I could, picking up some Ozzy stuff and so forth. And I remember the summer of '83, we got cable TV in my area, and so we had MTV. And that summer, they were showing the uh, Rainbow in the Dark video in pretty heavy rotation. Now, before that, I do remember I was buying Hit Parader magazine, and I remember Hit Parader doing a story about Ronnie James Dio, former Black Sabbath singer, in the studio with his new band Dio. And if I remember correctly, they mislisted the band, or the album title as Heavenly Diver instead of Holy Diver, which for some odd reason, I guess the journalists got mixed up somewhere down the line. But anyhow, it was a story about them in the studio, and they were talking about what they've been working on this album and everything. So seeing this Rainbow in the Dark video all the time on MTV, Ronnie just looks so cool. He's on the rooftop, the wind's blowing. He just looks menacing. He's got those white boots with the fur on them, and it's just like, wow, he just looks so cool. And then they show them, and they look like they're in like Chinatown or somewhere, and the Vivian comes out and does that crazy guitar solo with the hooker or whatever she is, a lady of the night or whatever, hanging on to his side. And Jimmy Bain comes out of the shadows playing bass. You never see Vinny in the actual video or so forth. I actually heard somewhere where Vivian said that they weren't supposed to be in the video and they were just hanging around. And the director pulled them in and used them in a scene. So that was kind of interesting. I've always wanted to ask. I've met Vivian a couple of times, and I always forget to ask him. I always want to know what kind of guitar that is he's playing in the video, because it looks like some open shop special, like from the Sears catalog or something. It looks like it doesn't even have any strings on it. I'd have to watch the video closer, I guess, and see. But I've always wanted to find out what that was. But seeing that video, that opened up my world to Dio, and I was like, I got to get this album. So, I remember the Holy Diver video. They started playing that as well, and it was probably Christmas before I got the album, Christmas of '83, before I first got the album, and it was on cassette originally. And that was just it. I was hooked on Dio by then, and the rest is history.
Cool. How about you, Darren?
Well, I was a big Ozzy fan, and I was really, really into Ozzy solo, and I was into Ozzy Sabbath. And so because of that, I was like, we've talked about this before in some of our videos and stuff, and we're reflecting on the early days in the '80s of getting into Sabbath and at what point we got into Sabbath and so on and so forth, and all magazines were basically pitting one camp against the other, and with the help of, they are interviewing Ozzy, and Ozzy had disparaging things to say about Black Sabbath, and likewise Tony Iommi would occasionally make some disparaging remarks in the press about Ozzy. It was going back and forth, so there was like a little bit of drama there, and I was into that, but I was on Team Ozzy. So when the Dio album came out, I remember my friend and I going to the record store, and we were walking by, and we were like, Dio, we are giving it the finger, and like holding it up and giving it the finger, F Dio. But then they started playing Rainbow in the Dark, and I couldn't help but like the song, and I did like, I liked Heaven and Hell, and I liked Mob Rules. I accepted them for what they were. I mean, it wasn't my Black Sabbath, but I liked the albums, and I like Dio's voice. But then when Dio was out of Sabbath, it was like he was fair game. Now he was, and of course there was also the rivalry with Ozzy and Ronnie the Dwarf. So everybody, we were playing into that. I think the general public were like pawns in this conflict between the two camps, between the Ozzy and the Black Sabbath camp. But because there was this thing instilled about Ronnie Dio being the enemy, it was hard to accept it when it came out. But what I heard was Rainbow in the Dark, and it was just undeniably a great song. I really like the keyboards in that, and it reminded me of, at the time, I remember it reminding me of like Man on the Silver Mountain. It had that kind of a vibe. So it leaned more into the Rainbow era than it did the Sabbath era, at least for that song. And then I heard Holy Diver, the song, and I thought that sounded pretty Sabbathy. So that was all it took. Then I went and I bought the album, and I liked it immediately. There was a lot of variety in the material. It didn't hang on one type of vibe for too long. As we all know now, having spent so much time with the album, there's a lot of different feelings within the album. You got like the Sabbathy Holy Diver, you got the more rainbow kind of sound, and Rainbow in the Dark, and Shame on the Night. You've got something more bluesy. So there's a real good range of music in this album, and I liked it. I mean, I couldn't help it. I didn't really want to like it as much as I did, but I wouldn't say I liked it as much as, like, say, Blizzard of Oz or Dire and Madman. But I definitely got into it, and from that point on, it became a pretty special record in my collection. Made me a Dio fan, which was not an easy task at that time, but it did.
Yeah, I'm very similar to you guys with this album, Tony. When you mentioned the Rainbow in the Dark video, I didn't know Ronnie from Rainbow. I was into Rainbow at that point, but I didn't own any of the Dio era Rainbow stuff. And that was just because I never saw it in my local record store. So I only knew Ronnie from Black Sabbath. And it's funny, before we made the video, I checked on this. Live Evil came out in January of '83, and Holy Diver comes out in May of '83. It's like 6 months later,
Yeah.
And of course,
you got busy.
Ronnie left the band, I'm sure, before Live Evil was officially released. But still, as a fan, I had gotten Live Evil, and 6 months later, Ronnie's solo, and he's got his own album out and everything. But and also, then again, this was back in the '80s, where it was very common. Things moved a lot quicker back then. You'd get one or two albums a year from bands. So 6 months for somebody to turn around and put out a solo album maybe wasn't that crazy. And I remember I had never seen any of those Black Sabbath videos that you see now for Heaven and Hell, like Die Young. And I think there's one for Neon Nights. I had never seen those. So the first time that I saw Ronnie, not in a magazine or something like that, was in the Rainbow in the Dark video. And I was unaware of Ronnie, like this whole thing with Ozzy and making fun of Ronnie's size and everything. I wasn't aware of that. And I didn't know that Ronnie was a very small man in stature. And in the Rainbow in the Dark video, you only see him on that rooftop. You never see him next to somebody else. And I distinctly remember those boots, those white boots, the jacket and everything, and the way Ronnie is kind of, moving around and everything. And in my mind, he seemed larger than life. Like he was this big, towering, powerful person. And I remember not too long after that reading, maybe it was, about Ozzy making fun of his height or something, and thinking, really? Because like in my mind, I had always envisioned him being like this big, sort of powerful thing. So Rainbow in the Dark was the first song that I heard from it. I saw the video. And when I got the album, I mean, I loved it, of course, because at this point I was just totally into Ozzy and Black Sabbath and the whole Black Sabbath universe. I remember being maybe a little disappointed that it wasn't as dark and as heavy as Mob Rules, songs like Sign of the Southern Cross and Falling Off the Edge of the World. You get that a little bit like Holy Diver. I could picture the song Holy Diver being a Black Sabbath song. I could picture Shame on the Night. That's one of the darker songs. Maybe I just forgot.
Gypsy's one that could almost be a Sabbath song.
Invisible.
Invisible, maybe. What's the other one I'm thinking of? Straight Through the Heart. That's one that I always thought it had a pretty heavy rip. But then there were other ones that, like, honestly, for me, Gypsy, it was not one of my favorites on the album. And Caught in the Middle is another one that's maybe a little, maybe this again harkens back. It made more sense to me when I discovered Dio with Rainbow. I was able to fill in, okay, Caught in the Middle. I could hear then the connection of Ronnie Black Sabbath and Ronnie Rainbow, because you get a little bit of both of those things, mixed in here. But I liked it. And I remember really being into Vivian Campbell, and I thought that we had just not that long ago lost Randy Rhoads, and I was just so devastated by that. I really felt like, okay, Randy Rhoads is my guitar player. He's my guitar hero, and I heard this guy on his first record, and I'm gonna follow him for his whole. I mean, I just absolutely loved Randy, still do. So in some ways, I transferred a little bit of that to Ronnie and Vivian Campbell and Ronnie. And I remember I had this poster that hung on the back of my door that I had gotten out of, I believe, a guitar magazine, where it's like Ronnie's there pointing, and he's got like that purple vest on that I think he had the boots on too, the white boots. And he's like pointing, and Vivian's just standing next to him with the white Charvel guitar. And he's kind of holding it in his arms and everything. And I was just like really invested in it. And I was, Vivian, although he wasn't Randy Rhoads, I could get behind this. I loved Vinny Appice coming over from Black Sabbath. And so, yeah, I really liked the album. And I think that I liked it back then, and it's also aged very well. It's Ronnie's, at this point, Ronnie has, if you want to go back to Elf, he had a certain degree of success with Elf. Elf leads to Rainbow, which is a big step up from Elf. You could probably say that Black Sabbath was even a step up for Ronnie. And now it just makes sense, him having a solo career at this point. This isn't like he's a very seasoned veteran at this point when Ronnie launches his solo career. Darren and I did a podcast. We have our Into the Void of Black Sabbath podcast, and we also cover the Dio and Ozzy solo albums. We did do Holy Diver. One thing that we did mention, sometimes the mix on this record, it's a little too bright for me. Now, they've recently just done a remix of the album as well as a remaster, and I think that does add a little bit more bass frequency, not bass the instrument. There's plenty of Jimmy Bain on here, which, by the way, I always loved Jimmy Bain. His bass sound is very He has a very unique bass sound, and it sits very well inside the mix. So I always thought that was cool. But in general, it's an album that I love. It's an album that's aged very well for me, that I can come back to all the time. And I can't really say there's anything I'm burnt out on this. Darren and I just did a Black Sabbath 10 most played songs, ranking them. And we talked about there's some burnout factor involved in some of those Sabbath songs, but I don't think there really is a burnout. When I hear Holy Diver, there's nothing I skip over on this album. So
To your point about how it seemed like, at least what I gathered from what you were talking about, how when you finally heard Rainbow, and then it all sort of fell into place for you, the two things that were taking place in this album. Yeah, I agree with that. But moreover, it just really sounded like, for a first outing, very together, very, very cohesive. Even the differences in songs, you'd have something like Caught in the Middle or Gypsy, and then you had Shame on the Night, Holy Diver. There were different. All the songs brought a different element to the album, but it all fit together so well. It was a very competent album from somebody who, this was his first solo album. But when you think about the bands that he was in and the role he played in both those bands, it's easy to see that this was somebody, Ronnie, that was bigger in talent and in determination than the bands that he was in. Because what he brought to this solo band sounded like a band. This could have been, if you're going to look at Dio, Holy Diver as a band, this could be like the fourth or fifth album.
Yeah,
it had that much confidence, and with the exception of the production, that was the only maybe telltale sign that this was an early release. Because as we all know, or as most of us know anyway, it was funded by out of their pockets. He and Wendy, they paid for the album themselves. They hadn't. I think the offer was there from Warner Brothers, but I don't think they got any money from Warner Brothers. Is that how it went? Because I thought that Ronnie, while he was still in Sabbath, had signed to a solo album deal, and that was one of the points of contention between he and Geezer and Tony, predominantly Tony. I think Tony was kind of upset about that, and that was sort of in the background. But then what he was going to do was have, like, it wasn't going to be a band as such. It was going to be Ronnie Dio, and he was going to have different musicians guest. I think that was his original intention.
Yeah.
But then once he left Sabbath, then he formed a band, and the band Dio pretty much rivaled his previous bands. I mean, Rainbow was still active, Sabbath was still active, but it was every bit as good as the bands that he had formerly been in, if not better in some ways. I won't say Sabbath, but probably Rainbow, depending on where you fall with your preference for singers. I mean, if you're not a JLT guy, then the Ronnie Holy Diver definitely kicked. What was it at the time? Was it Been Out of Shape? 83?
Probably,
probably Been Out of Shape or Straight Between the Eyes. Yeah.
And I like the JLT era Rainbows, but I think the Dio solo stuff gave it a run for
Rainbow was going more in the Foreigner direction at that period, and Dio was going heavy metal, full on heavy metal. They had to have some sort of funding though, because they recorded at Sound City, and I think that was a pretty popular recording studio. They said they rehearsed there on the back lot as well, and would basically write the songs, wheel the gear into the studio, record the song pretty much. And I remember reading somewhere about they built something to get that really heavy and bombastic drum sound that Vinny has on that album, that they built some sort of box, like wooden box, and had his drums assembled inside of there and mic'd the inside of the box to get that drum tone. So that's cool. And it's been so many cool stories, about them recording the album and so forth too. That I love the story about Rainbow in the Dark, where they said that Jimmy just walked over and They said we need something, we need a hook. And he walks over with a cigarette in his mouth and holding a drink, and pretty much puts the drink down and plays the little harmony on the keyboard, a doo 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 doo, and they're just like, that's it. That's what it needs. And that's that's the genius of Jimmy Bain. I mean, he was probably a guy that was just kind of chilling in the background. But he's thinking the whole time, well, let's try this.
He's kind of an underrated part of this band. And proof of it is that he comes back for Magica, right? And after he leaves after Dream Evil, he comes back for Magica. And I think, is he on Killing the Dragon?
Yeah, he's on Killing Killing the Dragon. He came back for Killing the Dragon, as well.
Magica. So
yeah.
And I know I've read Ronnie say this, that it's part of it is that, Jimmy was a songwriting contributor. He had a good sense. For instance, Vivian Campbell talks about, like in the song The Last in Line, they had the verse, they had the intro, but they didn't really have a way to get to the verse. And it was Jimmy's idea for the da-do, da-ga-da-ga-dun, dun, that little lick right there. And so I said that he was always good for things like that, like, hey, why don't we do this? Or here's a little lick to help glue this together, or something like that. So he was, an active part of the songwriting. And I also love, there's a quote from, I think it's Gloria Butler, Geezer Butler's wife, manager, where she says that, we knew that Ronnie was going to put out a good album. And this goes to your point, Darren, about how well formed it was. We knew it was going to be a good album. We didn't realize it was going to be this good, and it does come out really, really strong. And I think part of that or a lot of it is from Dio's previous experiences working with Elf, Rainbow, Black Sabbath. And also, and we've talked about this many times, Darren, that in the Black Sabbath, or really any situation that Ronnie's in, Ronnie's a true musician. He plays guitar, he plays bass, he can write melody lines. Tony Iommi has said it many times. He talks about, like, one of the first writing sessions with Ronnie, or the early sessions, and Ronnie stopped the band and said, hey, can you play this chord there? Because I want to sing this, and he told them the chord to play, and their jaws basically all dropped because they weren't, they were used to Ozzy, who couldn't really talk like that. And some of the songs, like when Ronnie first left Black Sabbath, it was just him and Vinny, and they had already basically worked out Holy Diver, and I believe Straight Through the Heart was the other one.
Don't Talk to Strangers.
Don't Talk to Strangers. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. And they were working on that, like in Ronnie's garage or something like that, as they were searching for a guitar player. But like you said, Darren, the first time that Ronnie is the sole producer, and maybe that shows his greenness a little bit, and with the production and everything. But yeah, it's such a strong statement, and there's no searching for your sound, like, what is this going to be, type of thing. I mean, it's very clear that Ronnie had a clear idea of what he wants to do. And like you said, it sounds like if this was a brand new band, nobody had any experience, you would think this was their third or fourth record, which is where bands usually found themselves, back in the 70s. It always took them 2 or 3 records. They experimented with different things, and then all of a sudden they figured out who they were. But this just comes out swinging. And I mean, Stand Up and Shout, Ronnie, the Dio band would be, pretty much all the Dio albums start like with a really upbeat, number that just comes out swing at you. I think it's a pretty bold move to put Holy Diver as the second song. A little interesting trivia. The first so many Dio band albums, the second song is always the title track. But I think it's a brave move with that long keyboard intro. Usually in that day and age, your second or third songs are like the ones that you expect to be radio songs. They're like to kind of hit him quick, hit him hard, hook them in. You would almost want to hear it maybe like ending side one, the way Heaven and Hell ended side one for that album. But you're right. It's a very confident album. Ronnie sounds absolutely fantastic on this. There's a chemistry with this band. And the proof of that, there's two things that are the proof of that for me. When this band, this band, meaning Vivian Campbell, Jimmy Bain, Vinny Appice, Ronnie, weren't together anymore. Although I love Dream Evil, it was never quite the same. Also, the band, The Last in Line, which is Vinny Appice, Vivian Campbell, originally Jimmy Bain, you can hear that there is a songwriting chemistry between those guys. So yeah, this is a band, young Vivian Campbell, basically unknown. And it is just, you can just feel the sort of the energy, and when you hear them tell stories about this album, that's what it sounded like it was. They were getting together in a room. The riffs were just flowing out of them. Ronnie's lyrics were just flowing. There doesn't seem to be nothing is forced on this record. It just seems like a bunch of guys getting together with a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, new band. They really believe in it. And it was a big success for Ronnie. I mean, it came right out. That Rainbow in the Dark video got played like mad on on MTV. The Holy Diver video got a fair amount. As a little weird side note, not that long, about a few weeks ago, out of curiosity, I tried to figure out what that church was where that was recorded, the Dio video, and it's like some church in England that it caught fire or something, and they were able to get in there like before they demolished the place. But there's another church in that same spot, so I thought that was interesting little trivia.
I remember later on, I think it was maybe later in the year, maybe it was even Halloween, MTV had a heavy metal concert thing, and they showed like Iron Maiden and Killers, and they showed Black Sabbath lip syncing two songs, Zero to Hero, and I believe it was Digital Bitch. But they showed, I think it was Dio in concert, and it was filmed at what I think was Perkins Place in Los Angeles at the time. And that is just full on live. And it was so cool to actually get to see them performing these songs live. It's just one part of them. They're open would stand up and shout, and this girl jumps up on stage, and Ronnie just dips her and then like kind of hands her like off to security or whatever. It's just great, But it was a really good. But what I was going to say, I remember I didn't have a VCR at the time, but I took a tape recorder and stuck it in front of the TV speaker and recorded, so I'd have some live Dio to listen to. Yeah, it's kind of cool.
I think that the time that this came out in its context musically, I think that it was good timing too, because we had already had Quiet Riot, Metal Health, and that kind of ushered in this whole wave of contemporary heavy metal. And so anything that was coming out at the time, I mean, people were very receptive to metal at this particular point in time, 83 moving forward. And so Dio coming out with this album right in the same year that a lot of things were starting to get really popular was good timing too. And it was a good album. But by the time The Last in Line came out, it was Dio had gone from being a very competent, the Dio band being a very competent band that was rivaling or every bit as capable as Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and Quiet Riot. He was right in there. But I think by the time that The Last in Line came out, everything that he had established since Holy Diver was released fed into The Last in Line. And by the time even when that album was released, there was already hype about it. I remember going to the record store and they had like a bunch of copies on the wall. There was a poster, big arena tour. I know that Holy Diver, I don't think, well, at least not on the East Coast, he wasn't playing arenas. He was still playing theaters. I mean, he played the Tower Theater. with Twisted Sister. But when The Last in Line came out, he was doing arenas, played the Philadelphia Spectrum with Twisted Sister again. But I mean, in just one album time, he jumped from playing theaters to arenas. Now that could have been because of the musical climate, or just a testimony to the quality of the music that he was putting out at that time. But it was really good timing for Dio to embark on a solo career. You know, and
Sure.
And the advent of MTV, like you mentioned, it was right there, and MTV was really starting to embrace the LA metal in general.
magazines too. I mean, he had Circus Magazine was all metal, Hit Parader was all metal. Of course, like the UK, the British magazines were already ahead of it. You know, we had Kerrang and Metal Hammer, which is I believe that was Germany, but Kerrang UK was reading about metal bands that were still fairly obscure in the US through the major publication in the UK, which was Kerrang. But by now, a few years later, 2 years later, the magazines that were basically like classic rock, where you'd see Queen, or maybe you'd see an article in John Denver and Circus Magazine. Now they were totally dedicated to heavy metal. Hit Parader, Circus, and Cream. Cream went off on a whole spin-off branch of the publication, and called Cream Metal. You know, so I mean, and Dio was in every single issue every month. I mean, you couldn't pick up an issue of Hit Parader, Circus, or Cream Metal, and there wouldn't be something about Dio in there. I mean, he went straight to the top. You know,
For sure.
I think his success exceeded what he did with any of his previous bands. Certainly with Rainbow. Black Sabbath, that was a hard act to top, but I think by the time Holy Diver had been out and getting ready to release, or upon releasing The Last in Line, he was A-list, you know, pretty quickly. So though, I think that's pretty cool in retrospect.
Yeah, for sure. And the stage show grew by the time he got to the second album.
Oh yeah.
Big Egypt stage show and all. Yeah.
Did you see that tour, The Last in Line? Did you?
No, my first Dio concert was Dream Evil tour.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was quite a spectacle. It had the pyramid, or it was the Egyptian stage set, big stage. Of course, it was in an arena. Yeah, I mean, a lot of money obviously went into that.
I remember buying that special from the Spectrum on VHS, and you remember back then they were like, it was like $35 for a VHS tape back then. But I was like, I gotta have this, you know.
Yeah, that was the show that was recorded, the show that I saw. Spectrum.
All right. Well, you guys got Tony, you got any final thoughts on the Holy Diver album?
Well, you know, we really hadn't got into much of the songs. I was gonna say to me, there's not a bad track on the album. I like everything. I do like Caught in the Middle. I think Caught in the Middle should have been a single, but it almost is like the precursor to Mystery, because it's probably the most really commercial song on there. It's more commercial than Rainbow in the Dark. But I think it would have made a good single, but I doubt Ronnie would have ever wanted it released as a single, because he didn't want Rainbow in the Dark as a single. Supposedly at the beginning, he said he didn't like it. And but I mean, I love Gypsy. I thought it was a super heavy song. I love the on the newly remixed version that's come out. They left Vivian's outro guitar solo on that. He's just shredding, and it's so cool to hear that. And you know, Straight Through the Heart and Stand Up and Shout are just such great songs as well. And that Stand Up and Shout is just a great album opener track. I was going to show a couple things that I had. I mean, I've always got crazy stuff in my collection. That's my Japanese copy of Holy Diver. It's actually on Mercury Records instead of.
I noticed that.
Yeah. And here's just a single for Holy Diver, and a single from Japan for Rainbow in the Dark, and also have the UK version. I had to take this off my wall back here. This is one of my prized possessions. This is actually autographed by Ronnie, Vivian, and Vinny. I met Jimmy Bain a couple of times, but I didn't have this with me when I went. So we got to meet him, so I didn't get any signature from him. But it would have been cool to have the complete signature set on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's Holy Diver is, to me, it's definitely a game changer for me in my life, and I love it. I think it's one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. That signed record there. That's incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome. So my favorite songs, and I mean, 1983 till now, I mean, spent a lot of time, and I think initially, like I said, my favorite, the one that really got the two that got my attention, Rainbow in the Dark and Holy Diver. Where I am now with it, I've always liked all the songs, but I think I really gravitate mostly to Shame on the Night. I like that ending rip. It's so heavy. It's like kind of doomy. It was the one song that I wasn't really crazy about when I first got the album. Thought it was a little bit. Didn't have as much stimulation for me as the other songs did. But I guess now that I'm older, or maybe I don't know, I just from lack of not as familiar with that as I was with the other songs, more up tempo songs. I've grown to appreciate that a lot more. Of course, Don't Talk to Strangers. That's just a great song. I wouldn't say I'm burned out on Rainbow in the Dark, but it doesn't excite me as much as like Straight Through the Heart, Shame on the Night, Don't Talk to Strangers. Invisible's really cool. Yeah, I mean it's still an album that I reach for pretty frequently. I like it. I don't think I'll ever get tired of listening to Holy Diver. I think it's always like you. It's always going to be one of like the ultimate heavy metal albums. I think it's cool that it was reintroduced into the market too with this remastered version.
For sure. Yeah.
It's a little strange listening to it. I mean, to be honest with you, I've only listened to it maybe twice. The new version, because I spent so much time with the original version. It's the one I naturally gravitate to. But for another generation of metal fans that are just getting into Dio, this is a good introduction. This is a good way to introduce the record to them. You get Jimmy's bass is a little bit more prominent in the mix. It gives it overall sound of the record a little bit more impact. So for no other reason, at least it introduces the record to a newer audience in a better way, I guess.
Hey, I did want to mention to you guys. I know we were talking about the way it was, the mix and everything that's on it, and the version that came out several years ago, the 2 CD version that came out. I thought it sounded better, but to me, I have this Rock Candy version that came out, and I don't know if you've heard this version, but to me, this is the best sounding version that I own. It's got more bottom end in it.
Right.
I think it just sounds so much better.
What year did that come out?
This was 2005, actually.
Okay.
Rock Candy always does a really good job with their reissues. It's got an interview with Ronnie at the end of it as well as a bonus track. I didn't even mention Don't Talk to Strangers. I think that's one of Vivian Campbell's best, if not his best, recorded guitar solo. It just rules on that song.
Yeah. He's all over the album in general. He sounds fantastic.
He was definitely crowned a guitar hero just from that album, for sure. It's a shame he didn't get to let loose in Def Leppard like he did. If you go see Last in Line, his band is just up there with an Engel, a Les Paul, and a few pedals, and he's having a ball because he's getting to really let loose.
I wanted to see them when they came around. I guess probably the first time was for the first album. I saw them at the theater in Stroudsburg, PA, and I was really looking forward to it because I mean I haven't seen Vivian Campbell I haven't seen Vivian Campbell probably live since 1984, and so we went into this theater and we would just walk right down in front, and there he is on stage, and even though he's been with Thin Lizzy for a minute, he's been in Def Leppard now for several years. He was in Whitesnake for a minute. He's a big celebrity, I guess you could say. But he came out on stage and it was just like he was like saying hello to everybody, just really laid back and pretty cool. But man, when when he started launching into this material and he just started firing off these leads, it was like, man, this is Vivian Campbell. He's every bit as good now, if not better than he was in the 80s. And I was like, whoa, he's still amazing. And it is a shame that he can't really like do that kind of stuff with Def Leppard, but I guess, I mean, he's making enough money where it's like, okay, well, they're paying me to do what I do, and that's fine. But it's easy to understand why he has the last in line. This is his chance to like, just really have fun and play guitar the way he was made to play guitar, which is,
It's a shame that he and Ronnie didn't make up before Ronnie passed. I think when Vivian got sick, he did a little soul searching himself because they said a lot of nasty things about each other in the press over the years. And it's one of those things where, I can't. I think Vivian said if he had just ran into him somewhere, they probably would have cussed each other out for a second, and then they would have like, hey, let's go to the bar and have a beer and hang out.
Some of their fighting though, man, it was pretty funny if you watch that stuff on YouTube.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
The one thing, and we've talked about it before. I know we talked about it in the podcast. Where Ronnie's outside either outside the venue or he's standing by the bus or something, and he's signing autographs. And he's signing one guy's autograph, and another guy's talking around. He's like, "Hey man, hey Ronnie, I saw Vivian the other day. I went to see Def Leppard." He's like, "Def Leppard, huh? Oh, that's a good band to have diarrhea to."
Yeah, and then Ronnie had to go back, and he went back into press and apologized to Joe Elliott and the guys, and
Oh, did he? Yeah.
and he was like, "And fuck you to the guy who put the video on YouTube."
And I think that Vivian, it is nice to see with the last in line that he's re-embraced his time in Dio, because for a while there he pretty much disowned it. And I remember finding that really disheartening that after he had left Dio, and I love Dio so much, and to hear Vivian sort of mock and make fun of that type of music, like just metal in general and that type of stuff. And this was before he was in Def Leppard, when he was doing River Dogs and things like that. And so it's nice to see him come back and embrace, his legacy. And I think he realizes that there was good music there, that he does truly enjoy playing this. And he's clarified, I think. He got painted as the bad guy in that whole situation. And now when you hear him talk about it, and of course, whenever you hear these stories, Wendy Dio has her side of the story and Vivian has his side of the story. Well, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. But both of them talk about money. And as anybody out there knows, that you want to end a friendship quick, get money involved in it somehow, right? And this is not an old story, bands fighting about money, one guy, in it leading to somebody leaving or a band breaking up. So it's completely understandable. But it is nice to see the last in line band, and Vivian especially, embracing this, his past, and playing, like you said, Darren, with a lot of fire. I think he sounds fantastic. So yeah. All right. Well, there we go. Dio, Holy Diver, 40th anniversary. Just as a little fun thing, before we did this podcast, I was in my kitchen making some iced tea, and I asked Alexa to play for me some songs from, if we went to 1983 and went back 40 years, what would be? And Alexa started playing stuff like Chattanooga Choo Choo and things like that. So that's how far away Holy Diver is from us today, as in 1983 Chattanooga Choo Choo was too. So it's pretty funny and hard to believe, 40 years, but it's an album that never grows old. It's certainly whenever people are making a list of the the all-time greatest metal albums of all time, you know that Holy Diver is going to be high up on that list. So everybody out there, let us know what your thoughts are of Holy Diver, what your memories are of hearing Holy Diver. How about today? How do you feel about the album today? Let us know in the comments down below. I'd like to thank Tony Dio for joining us here at the Lair and for Sabbath Sunday. And till we see you all again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.